A new day had dawned. But for some people in and around Jerusalem, it was not a day like any other day. Jesus was dead, and their world had collapsed. Their minds were spinning in chaotic confusion, and their spirits were sunk in deep depression. They knew that their lives would never be the same again. Still, a new day had dawned, and according to all four gospel accounts, women rose early so they could go to the tomb of their friend, their mentor, their leader, and prepare his body for final burial. Mark identifies three people: Mary Magdalene, another Mary, this one the mother of James, and someone named Salome. As they trudged along the path to the cemetery, carrying the spices which they had bought, they realized that perhaps their preparations, made in considerable haste and emotional distress, would not be sufficient. For you see, on the way they suddenly realized that the large stone, which had been rolled into place to seal the tomb, would have to be moved aside so that they could gain entrance. Who would do it? Even with the three of them working together, they would not have the strength to get that accomplished. So imagine their surprise when, upon arrival at their destination, they saw that the stone, described as very large, had already been pushed out of the way, and the place in which Jesus' body lay was open. Consider the thoughts that must have been rushing through their brains for the past few days as they recounted all that had happened in just one seemingly short week. On what many were already calling Palm Sunday, Jesus and his disciples had entered Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover, or at least that's what the disciples had been expecting. And what a rousing welcome they received. Crowds lined the streets through which the party passed. Jesus on a donkey and his followers announcing his arrival, while folks waved branches and threw their coats and cloaks on the path to cushion the steps of the animal, as they shouted their greeting, their joy, their anticipation, indicating that at least some of them thought he was the Messiah whose coming had been prophesied in their scriptures. That was Sunday. But events began a downward slide from there. The next day, Jesus caused quite a ruckus and made many new enemies when, in righteous fury, he entered the temple courtyard and, after knocking over the tables of the money changers and the dove sellers, shut down their businesses and physically drove them away. It was then that the priests and scribes, who got a cut of the profits from all such transactions, decided that he had to go and began planning how to get rid of him. During the following days, Jesus returned to the temple and taught, speaking to his friends and his enemies regarding what he perceived to be God's will for his people. And on Thursday night, the same group that had so triumphantly entered the city gathered for the beginning of the holiday celebration. During the ceremonial part of the meal, Jesus, as host, passed around the bread and the wine, but indicated that their symbolic meaning would now be enlarged, that the bread was like his body, and the wine was like his blood, which would soon be given up as an example of sacrificial love. His followers did not really believe that he, the one they thought was the Messiah, was really predicting his own death. They could not accept that, especially since the week had began so hopefully. And they argued with him that this could not be, promising that they would stay with him through thick and thin, no matter what. But all that was going on really gave them something to think about as they headed out toward the Garden of Gethsemane. Once they arrived, Jesus told them that he needed some time to himself, but asked them to remain awake and alert while he prayed. This they promised to do, but they soon fell asleep. Jesus went off a ways and agonized over what he was sure was about to happen, while asking God if his impending torture and death were really necessary. He finally came to a place within his own mind of peace and acceptance, just as the captors sent by his enemies found him. As his disciples ran away, these armed guards roughly handled and bound him, then led him back to town to appear before the temple authorities and the city leaders. There he was questioned and abused, after which they determined that he must die, something which they had already decided before this sham of a trial, and arranged to take him to the Roman governor for sentencing. Pontius Pilate, after talking with Jesus, claimed that he could find no legitimate grounds for their accusations, but afraid of the threat of rebellion and what such a revolt would do to his standing back in Rome, succumbed to their demands and decreed that he would be executed by crucifixion. The soldiers took him away. They beat him and mocked him, after which they pushed him on the long march to Golgotha, dragging his own cross. After arriving at Calvary, they nailed his wrists to the crossbar and his feet to the trunk, then slammed the cross into the ground with a jarring jolt. Now it was only a matter of time. As he hung there, his enemies walked around, reviling him, and only some of the women who were part of his entourage were with him to the end. When he was dead, Joseph of Arimathea, a city leader but also a follower, asked for Jesus' body so that he could be buried in a tomb Joseph had prepared for himself when the time came. And it was Joseph who had the stone placed to seal the tomb. Now here they were. With a bit of fear and trembling, they approached the open entrance, which should not have been open, and peered inside. There, according to the account, sat a young man in a white robe who told them that Jesus, whose body they were expecting to find and anoint, was gone, that he had been raised, that he was again alive. And they were to tell Peter and the others that Jesus would appear to them in Galilee. So filled with fear they were that they ran away. And for a period of time they said nothing to anybody, perhaps because they thought they would not be believed. Resurrection. Easter is all about resurrection. And while the cross is the primary symbol of resurrection in Christianity, let us not forget the significance and importance of the empty tomb and its rolled back stone. Consider again the feelings of the women before they made their incredible discovery. They, as the rest of the disciples, were dazed and baffled by the tragic events that ended with Calvary. Their hopes and dreams were gone. Their Lord of life and love was dead, and so much that was good and beautiful had died with him. They had just experienced a gorgeous sunrise, but their heavy hearts prohibited them from enjoying it, or from perhaps even seeing it. What would they do? These people who had contributed 3 years of their lives to a prophetic promise which they were sure was now over. They had neither the energy nor the will to go on. But now they found an empty tomb. Are there any stones in your life, large or small, blocking you from happiness and discouraging you to the point of desperation and despair? Are you ever tempted to ask, as did the women, who will roll away the stone for us? Do you ever approach the tombs of your life expecting to find that which had defeated you, only to discover that somehow the burden has been lifted and the tomb is now empty? With all the difficulties you face, are you able to see and enjoy the beautiful sunrises that promise constantly new and renewed life? There is a God at work in all this, and usually he rolls back the stones that block us through the efforts and concern of those who care about us. Resurrection. Jesus' resurrection is not an easy thing to explain or understand. The brightest theologians have agonized over the issue for more than 2,000 years, and they have come up with different theories and interpretations. A literal interpretation argues that Jesus boldly rose from the grave, emerged from the tomb after the stone had been miraculously rolled back, and appeared over and over to people until his ascension into heaven on his way back to God. Such a vision is principally advanced by Luke and John in their Gospels. Of interest is the apparent fact that while the stone had to be removed for Jesus to escape from the tomb, he was able to either simply appear to people at will, as if from nowhere, or walk through doors and windows to reach them and be solid flesh when he arrived. Paul, the earliest of the New Testament writers, seems to suggest that the resurrection was a spiritual one rather than a physical one, or at least he does not write about it being physical. What he does write about is the Spirit of Jesus coming to those who believed in him and changing their lives because in and through him they came into a closer relationship with God. Still other scholars, those of a more liberal bent, suggest that at least some of the Easter story developed over time, as early Christians, particularly the disciples, reflected on what they had seen, what they had heard, what they had experienced, and came to certain conclusions regarding the meaning and message of Christ. Conclusions which impacted them in such a way that they followed the path Jesus had laid before them and continued his mission in the world. In such a way, then, he defeated death and lived again. Some also think that most of the post-Easter story really took place in Galilee rather than in Jerusalem, as one might see in the Gospel of Mark, and that what happened over a greater span of time than just 3 days. It seems to me that what is important here, indeed essential, is a realization that the tomb was empty, regardless of precisely what this means or how the event is interpreted. The tomb was empty. Christ, whether physically or spiritually, was alive, and his work would be continued by and through those who believed that he was alive because he now lived in them. We can argue ad infinitum the details of the occurrence, and from various perspectives, historical, scientific, philosophical, theological, but none of that matters once one grasps the magnitude of the claim that Christ lives. And because Christ lives, our lives can be more full and complete. Some years ago, I made the observation in an Easter sermon that on Easter morning, the most surprised individual in the world was Jesus Christ. I argued that if he had known with absolute guarantees and unquestionable certainty ahead of time that he would defeat death and live again, his commitment and faithfulness, his courage and fortitude would have been less than was evidenced by the doubts and fears he expressed even at the end, and still went through with what he believed God expected from him. Think about that. He went to the cross hoping and believing that resurrection would happen, but not perfectly certain that it would. And do we not approach life and death in the same way? But because of our belief in the resurrection, we too have faith that life and love are eternal. On that Easter morning, the women walking to the tomb experienced a wonderful sunrise. And I am fancifully imagining a Christ in the tomb, waking up, looking out through the opening that had been created by the rolled away stone, and seeing that same wonderful sunrise. So what about us? Because of an empty tomb and a living Christ, can we also see wonderful sunrises as we look to those openings created when the stones of hurt and heartbreak, of pain and loss, of injustice and disillusionment, which have entombed us, are rolled aside, and perhaps in the distance, light appears in the opening, light shining on an ever new world. When that happens, we too will have experienced resurrection.